She was fired for kindness. Imagine working 5 long years in a wealthy mansion, giving your sweat and your youth, only to be thrown out in a single moment, just because you fed a hungry old man. That was Elizabeth's life. A maid with nothing left but her dignity, standing on the edge of despair. But what she didn't know was that her act of compassion, something so small, so human, would set in motion a chain of events that would change her destiny forever. This is not just a story about losing everything. It's about how kindness can rebuild your entire life. This was how it all started. The first sound Elizabeth woke up to was not an alarm clock. It was the quiet hum of the city slowly stirring to life. Outside her tiny apartment window, the roosters in the neighbor's yard had already announced the break of dawn, and the faint call of a street vendor echoed in the distance. She sat up slowly, her body heavy from yesterday's labor, and whispered a prayer under her breath. "Lord, give me strength for today." Her room was small, just big enough for a narrow bed, a chipped wooden wardrobe, and a small table that doubled as her ironing board. On that table lay her neatly pressed uniform, the one she wore almost every single day for the last 5 years. White blouse, gray skirt, black shoes, nothing fancy, but always spotless. She believed in dignity, even if the world often forgot to give her any. Elizabeth wrapped her headscarf tightly, smoothing it over her hair, then glanced at the faded photograph tucked into the frayed corner of her mirror. It was her father, smiling despite the illness that stole him from her years ago. That photo reminded her of why she worked so hard, why she never allowed herself to give up. The Baldwin mansion was her destination, a place that sparkled with chandeliers and polished marble, where music drifted softly from grand pianos, and where fine china was set on dining tables that could seat 20. Elizabeth had learned to glide through those halls, quietly, as though she were invisible, to polishing silver trays, dusting expensive shelves, scrubbing floors until her knees ached. But when she returned home at night, her reality was far from the glittering world she served. Sometimes she came back to find the lights cut off because she couldn't pay the bill. Other nights, she found her younger brother struggling with homework, his stomach empty because their food had run out. It was a strange life, living between two worlds. By day, she handled luxury she would never taste. By night, she fought to keep her small apartment from crumbling. Yet through it all, she carried herself with quiet pride. She told herself that her hands were not just scrubbing floors, they were building a future, that one day, these sacrifices would mean something. And still, deep down, there was an ache she could not silence. Because no matter how much she tried, she always wondered, how long could she keep this balance before something broke? What Elizabeth didn't know was that life was about to test her in a way she never imagined. And it all started with a single ordinary Tuesday morning. Elizabeth's mornings at the Baldwin mansion always began the same way. The front gates opened with a creak, and a tall iron bar seemed to swallow her whole. As she walked inside, the garden stretched endlessly, trimmed hedges, perfectly shaped roses, blooming in colors that felt almost unreal. A fountain in the center gushed crystal-clear water. A sound so peaceful it might have calmed anyone, except Elizabeth, who knew she did not belong here. The staff lined up in the kitchen, waiting for instructions from Mistress Baldwin's sharp voice. Some of them chatted quietly, laughing about new handbags or shoes they hoped to buy from their wages. Elizabeth stood quietly at the back, her hands clasped. She wasn't thinking about handbags or shoes. She was thinking about the envelope of unpaid bills sitting on her table at home. Her landlord's words from the night before echoed in her head. "Miss Elizabeth, if you don't pay your rent by next month, I'll have no choice but to let the room go." Her throat tightened. She had been living paycheck to paycheck for years, but lately the weight seemed heavier. Her younger brother Samuel was in his final year of school. His fees needed to be paid. His books needed to be bought. And sometimes, Elizabeth skipped her own meals just to make sure he had enough. Still, every morning, she pressed her uniform, tied her scarf neatly, and walked into this palace as though she had no cares in the world. Mistress Baldwin's orders cut through the air that morning. "Elizabeth, make sure the silver is polished before lunch. I have guests coming." "Yes, madam," Elizabeth replied softly. The hours slipped by as she dusted shelves and scrubbed marble tiles. Her back ached, but she never complained. Some of the other maids whispered about her, saying she was too quiet, too serious. Others envied her discipline, but none of them knew what it cost her to hold her head high. When her shift ended, Elizabeth returned to her tiny apartment. Pushing open the creaky door, Samuel was hunched over a borrowed textbook, his pencil scratching furiously on paper. He looked up and smiled faintly, but she noticed the hunger in his eyes. "Did you eat?" she asked. Hay shook his head. "I was waiting for you." Elizabeth's chest tightened. She quickly set water to boil, pouring the last handful of rice into the pot. As the grains bubbled, she forced a smile. "Tomorrow will be better, Samuel. Just keep studying. One day you'll make us both proud." But as she lay down later that night, her stomach empty, her mind heavy with fear, Elizabeth could not stop herself from wondering how long could she keep living like this, standing between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The answer came on a crisp Tuesday morning, when Elizabeth stepped outside to take out the trash and found someone who would change her life forever. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, or at least that's what Elizabeth thought as she tied her headscarf and picked up the heavy trash bins from the side of the Baldwin mansion. The air was crisp, carrying a gentle chill that made her pull her uniform tighter around her shoulders. The sun had just begun to rise, painting streaks of orange across the sky. She walked carefully across the driveway, her shoes clicking softly against the stone, when something unusual caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just another homeless wanderer, sitting on the curb outside the mansion gates. But as she moved closer, her steps slowed. There he was, a frail old man, hunched over, his hands trembling violently. His clothes were threadbare, his shoes worn thin. A small plastic cup of water sat loosely in his shaking grip, but most of it spilled onto his lap before it reached his lips. Elizabeth froze, her heart clenching in recognition. She had seen those tremors before. She had watched her own father's hands tremble in the same way, had seen the way Parkinson's disease stole his strength, little by little, until he could barely lift a spoon. The man's eyes lifted to hers. They were tired, hollow yet gentle, like someone who had carried too many years of pain. For a second, Elizabeth felt her breath catch. The other staff were nearby, whispering among themselves. One of them muttered, "Don't bother, Elizabeth. He's just another stray. Madam won't like this." Elizabeth swallowed hard. She could have walked away. She could have gone back inside pretending she hadn't seen him. That would have been the safer choice. But her heart refused. Without another word, she turned back toward the kitchen, ignoring the stares that followed her. She quickly filled a bowl with warm soup, grabbed a slice of bread, and wrapped a small blanket over her arm. Then she hurried back to the old man. Kneeling beside him, she held the spoon gently to his lips. "Eat slowly, Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're not alone. Not today." The man blinked back tears as he took the first bite. His frail body shook, but his eyes shone with gratitude. It had been so long since someone had looked at him not as a burden, but as a human being. Elizabeth smiled faintly, though her own chest ached. She thought of her father, wishing someone had shown him the same kindness when she wasn't around. What she didn't realize, as she fed the man quietly by the curbside, was that someone else was watching, and the cost of her compassion was about to fall heavily on her shoulders. Because, just as Elizabeth whispered words of comfort to the old man, a sharp, Angry voice thundered behind her, a voice she knew all too well. The old man's hands trembled as Elizabeth guided the spoon to his lips. He sipped slowly, his frail body struggling, but his eyes shining with something she recognized: hope. For a moment, it felt as though the world had gone silent. Just her, him, and the quiet dignity of kindness. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse but sincere. His gaze softened and a tear slipped down his cheek. Elizabeth's heart squeezed. She tucked the blanket around his shoulders and pressed the bread gently into his hand. "You don't have to thank me. Just eat, Papa. You need your strength." But the fragile peace shattered in an instant. "Elizabeth." The voice cracked through the air like a whip, sharp, cold, commanding. Elizabeth stiffened before slowly turning. Standing a few feet away was Mistress Baldwin herself, her manicured hand clutching her silk robe, her face twisted in disgust. "What on earth are you doing?" she demanded, her eyes darting between Elizabeth and the old man. Elizabeth swallowed, her voice small but steady. "Madam, he's sick. He hasn't eaten. I just thought—" "You thought, mistress?" Baldwin's voice rose sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "You dare bring strays onto my property feeding beggars like some charity worker. Do you realize how this looks?" The other staff had gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves, eyes wide. Some smirked, glad it wasn't them. Others looked away, unwilling to be caught in the storm. Elizabeth's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. "Madam, he's someone's father, someone's grandfather. Please, just let him rest a little. He's not hurting anyone." Mistress Baldwin's face flushed with rage. "Are you deaf, Elizabeth?" I said. "Get rid of him. Throw him out now." Elizabeth's heart pounded, fear clawing at her chest. She knew what defiance would cost her. She knew this job was her only lifeline. But when she looked back at the old man, so weak and helpless, her decision was already made. Her voice shook, but it carried a quiet strength. "I can't, madam, I won't. Not when he's suffering like this." Gasps rippled through the staff. Mistress Baldwin's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a cold smile. "Then you leave me no choice." Her words fell heavy, final, like a stone sinking into water. "You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house immediately." Elizabeth's breath caught fire. Just like that, after years of loyal service, years of sacrifice, she was being cast aside for choosing compassion. The old man looked at her with sorrow, his eyes glistening as if to apologize. But Elizabeth forced a small smile, hiding the storm inside her. She bowed her head slightly. "Yes, madam." And with that, she stood, her dignity intact, though her world had just begun to crumble. As Elizabeth walked back into the mansion to pack her belongings, whispers followed her, but deep inside, one question burned. Had she just ruined her life, or saved something far greater? Elizabeth's legs felt heavy as she walked back into the mansion, each step echoing louder than usual against the polished marble floors. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of finality. She had just lost the job that kept her and her brother alive. The other staff didn't waste time. Their whispers filled the air like buzzing flies. "She really argued with Madam. Foolish girl. Kindness won't feed you. She'll regret this." Elizabeth kept her head high, though her heart pounded painfully in her chest. She moved quietly to her small quarters at the back of the house, where she folded her uniforms with shaking hands, and placed them neatly into her old, scratched suitcase. Every item she packed was soaked with memories of days. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached. Of nights, she stayed late, polishing silver, while everyone else went home. She thought about Samuel, her younger brother, and her chest tightened. How will I tell him? How will I pay his fees? But even as the fear gripped her, she couldn't push away the image of the old man's eyes when she handed him that bowl of soup, those eyes filled with gratitude. told her she had done the right thing. Her door creaked open slightly, and one of the younger maids peeked in. "Elizabeth," she whispered nervously. "I'm sorry, you didn't deserve this." Elizabeth forced a faint smile. "Thank you, but don't worry about me. Take care of yourself." The girl nodded quickly and disappeared, afraid of being caught showing sympathy. Elizabeth dragged her small suitcase down the long corridor as she passed through the grand hall one last time. Mistress Baldwin stood near the staircase, arms crossed, lips curled in triumph. "You brought this on yourself," she said coldly. "I hope you learn your lesson." Elizabeth stopped, her grip tightening on the suitcase handle. For a moment she wanted to scream, to tell Mistress Baldwin that kindness was not weakness, that cruelty was not strength. But she bit her tongue. Dignity was the only thing she still owned, and she refused to lose it now. She lowered her head respectfully and walked out of the mansion gates. The morning sun hit her face, and with it came a sting of tears she had been holding back. The world outside seemed colder, harsher, but at least it was honest. Behind her, the mansion gleamed with its golden windows and towering walls. Ahead of her, uncertainty stretched like an endless road. As she walked away, her suitcase wheels rattling against the pavement, she whispered to herself, "I don't regret it. I never will." But still, a heavy question lingered in her heart. Would kindness be the very thing that destroyed her future, or the key that would unlock it? The morning air felt colder as Elizabeth stepped out of the Baldwin mansion for the last time. Her small suitcase rattled against the stone driveway, each clatter echoing like a drumbeat of finality. She didn't dare look back, not yet if she did. The tears threatening to spill would surely come pouring down. But she could hear them, the faint murmurs of the staff clustered near the kitchen door, watching her departure as though it were a spectacle. Some pitied her, their faces softened with sympathy. Others smirked, as if satisfied that she had finally fallen. "She was too proud," one whispered. "No," another replied. "She was too kind, and kindness doesn't survive here." Elizabeth kept walking. She refused to let their words stick to her. But deep inside, her chest tightened. She had given this house nearly 5 years of her life, her strength, her youth, and now she was leaving with nothing but a suitcase and a heavy heart. At the gates, she finally turned. The Baldwin mansion stood tall, its white walls gleaming in the sunlight, its windows reflecting a life of comfort that was never hers to claim for years. She had polished those windows until her fingers were raw. For years she had lived in the shadows of chandeliers and marble halls, invisible to the ones who lived there. And yet, as she stared at it one last time, she didn't feel anger. What she felt was sorrow. Sorrow that a place so beautiful on the outside could be so cold within. Her eyes drifted to the curbside where the old man had been. He was gone now, but the memory of his trembling hands, his grateful eyes lingered. That single moment, that act of compassion, had cost her everything. Still, Elizabeth knew in her soul she could never have chosen differently. With a deep breath, she whispered under her breath, "I won't regret this. Not today. Not ever." She pulled her suitcase onto the sidewalk and began the long walk back to her tiny apartment. The city streets buzzed with noise. Children running to school, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, cars honking impatiently, but to Elizabeth, it all blurred into a haze. Each step felt heavier than the last. As she turned the corner, a tear finally slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, lifting her chin. She had lost her job. Yes, she had lost her security, but she had not lost herself. And somewhere deep inside, though, she couldn't see it yet, life was already shifting. Something was waiting for her, hidden just beyond the horizon. But for now, all Elizabeth knew was the silence of her small apartment, and the frightening question that haunted her. How would she survive with nothing left? The door to Elizabeth's small apartment creaked as she pushed it open. The familiar scent of damp walls and old wood greeted her, a sharp contrast to the polished marble and perfumed air of the Baldwin mansion she had just left. Behind her suitcase thudded onto the floor, and for the first time in years, she felt truly empty. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands covering her face. The silence in the room was deafening. No voices ordering her around. No clatter of dishes or footsteps in grand hallways. Just silence. And in that silence, the fear came crashing in. How would she pay the rent? How would she keep the lights on? How would she feed Samuel, her younger brother, who depended on her for everything? The image of her landlord's stern face returned. "Miss Elizabeth, I can't keep waiting. If you don't pay next month, I'll have to let the room go." She shuddered. Next month was only weeks away, and now she had no income. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope on the small wooden table. Inside were the unpaid bills stacked like silent enemies. Electricity, water, school fees. She pressed the papers to her chest and let out a shaky breath. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Sister," Samuel's voice. He stepped into the room, his school bag slung over one shoulder. His uniform slightly worn but clean. He paused when he saw her tear-stained cheeks. "What happened?" Elizabeth forced a weak smile, wiping her face quickly. "Nothing, Samuel. Just tired, that's all." But Samuel wasn't a child anymore. His eyes searched hers with quiet worry. "Did something happen at work?" Elizabeth hesitated. She wanted to protect him from the truth, to carry the burden alone, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. I lost my job." Samuel's face fell. His shoulders slumped, but after a moment he straightened. "It's okay, sister. You've carried me all this time. Maybe it's my turn now." Her heart broke and healed in the same breath. She reached for him, pulling him close. "No, Samuel, don't you ever say that. Your only job is to finish school, to chase the future we both dreamed of. I'll find a way, I always do." He nodded silently, resting his head against her shoulder. But Elizabeth could feel the tremble in his small frame, the fear he tried to hide. That night, after Samuel fell asleep, Elizabeth lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling. Her body was exhausted, but her mind refused to rest. For the first time in a long while, she felt like the walls were closing in, and though she tried to be strong, a terrifying thought whispered in her heart. What if this time I can't rise again? Elizabeth didn't know that beyond the walls of her little apartment, whispers of her kindness had already begun to spread, and one pair of ears, in particular, was listening closely, while Elizabeth wrestled with fear inside her dim apartment. Life at the Baldwin mansion carried on as though nothing had happened. The chandeliers still glittered above polished floors. Fine meals were still served on gold-rimmed plates. But beneath the surface, murmurs were spreading among the staff. "She really stood up to Madam," one cook whispered as she kneaded dough. Another maid leaned in, lowering her voice. "And all for an old man. Can you imagine who does that?" "Someone braver than us," the cook muttered. Their words floated through the halls, and though most were too afraid to say it aloud, many admired Elizabeth's courage. She had chosen dignity over fear, kindness over security, and in a house ruled by Mistress Baldwin's iron hand, that choice was unforgettable. Mistress Baldwin, however, remained furious. She paced her sitting room in her silk robe, venting to a close friend over the phone. "The nerve of that girl feeding strays. Like she's running a soup kitchen. I will not have this house turned into a charity." Her friend murmured something, but Mistress Baldwin only scoffed. "No, I don't regret firing her. People like that don't belong here." But not everyone agreed. Upstairs, in a quieter part of the house, Charles Baldwin sat near a window listening. His hands rested heavily on the arms of his chair, his breath shallow but steady. Time had weighed on him. His body slower now, but his mind still sharp. He had long grown weary of his wife's cruelty, her obsession with appearances, her coldness toward those she saw as beneath her. And now, hearing about Elizabeth, he shook his head slowly. That woman, he muttered under his breath, though whether he meant his wife or the maid even, he wasn't sure. Charles remembered glimpses of Elizabeth from years before, the quiet maid who polished the windows without complaint, who carried herself with unusual grace. Despite her position, he remembered once catching her, humming softly to herself, as she arranged flowers, a small but genuine smile lighting her face. There had been something different about her, something human. As the whispers spread, some staff carried the story outside the walls. Elizabeth's act of kindness became a small tale repeated in hushed tones around town. The maid, who fed a sick old man and lost her job for it. Most who heard it shook their heads at the injustice, but none knew just how far those whispers would travel. For even as Elizabeth lay awake in her cramped room, staring at the cracked ceiling in despair, someone else was already piecing the story together. Someone whose life was directly tied to the frail old man she had shown kindness to. And just 3 days later, as Elizabeth sat worrying about rent and survival, an unexpected knock at her door would change everything. 3 days passed, and each one stretched longer than the last. Elizabeth sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers nervously tracing the seams of her skirt. The unpaid bills still sat on the table, staring at her like silent reminders of failure. Samuel tried to comfort her, but she could see the worry etched into his young face every time he thought she wasn't looking. She had gone out that morning searching desperately for any kind of work, a laundress, a vendor, anything but doors closed politely in her face. No one wanted to hire a maid, who had been dismissed under bad terms. Whispers had already traveled further than she imagined. By the time she returned to the apartment, the heaviness on her chest was unbearable. She sat by the window, staring out at the street below where children played with sticks, and by old women bartered over vegetables. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Again she had done enough crying. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound startled her. No one ever came to visit for a moment. She froze, her mind racing. The landlord, a neighbor, another debt collector. Elizabeth, Samuel called softly from the corner. Someone's at the door. She rose slowly, smoothing her scarf with trembling fingers, and opened it. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a tailored navy blue suit. His presence filled the narrow hallway, his posture straight, his face calm, but carrying a weight she couldn't yet understand. "Are you Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. "Yes," she replied cautiously, her heart thudding. The man gave a faint nod. "My name is Derek Baldwin." Elizabeth's breath caught the name, hit her like a stone in her chest. Baldwin, the very name she had just been cast out. For a second she feared Mistress Baldwin had sent someone to humiliate her further. But Derek's next words stopped her cold. "I'm the son of Charles Baldwin." The world around her seemed to tilt. Charles Baldwin. The frail old man she had fed by the curb, the one she had been fired for protecting. Elizabeth gripped the door frame to steady herself, her lips parting but no words coming out. Derek's gaze softened. "I came to thank you. My father told me what you did. You fed him. You treated him like a human being, when even those closest to him turned their backs. Do you have any idea what that means to me?" Elizabeth's voice trembled. "Your father. He was the man outside, the one I—" "Yes," Derek said firmly. "That was him." Her heart raced as her mind scrambled to understand. All the fear, the shame, the worry of the last 3 days seemed to swirl into confusion. Why was he here? What did this mean? Derek's eyes locked onto hers, steady and intense. "Elizabeth," I don't believe in accidents, and meeting you today is no accident. But Elizabeth couldn't yet know that this visit was not just to say, thank you. Derek had come with an offer that would turn her world upside down. Elizabeth's knees felt weak as she motioned for Derek to step inside the tiny apartment. He ducked slightly through the narrow doorway, his sharp navy suit looking out of place against the peeling paint and sagging ceiling. Samuel peeked out from the corner, eyes wide, whispering softly, "Who is he?" It's fine, Samuel," Elizabeth said, though her own voice quivered. Derek glanced around the small space, his gaze lingering for a moment on the stack of unpaid bills on the table before. Returning to Elizabeth, he didn't speak at first. Instead, he removed his jacket and folded it neatly over the chair, his movements precise but unhurried. Finally, he looked at her, his tone gentle but steady. "My father is Charles Baldwin," he said again, as if she hadn't fully believed him the first time. "The man you helped outside the mansion gates. That was him." Elizabeth pressed her palm to her chest. "But I thought he was just—" She stopped herself, ashamed of the word she almost used. "A beggar," Derek finished softly. "That's what everyone thinks when they see him like that. But no, my father is not a beggar. He chose to walk away from the mansion years ago. I couldn't stand the coldness, the cruelty, the way my mother treated people as if they were disposable, so he left. He told me he'd rather live simply, even with his illness, than stay trapped in that house." Elizabeth's eyes widened. She had only known Charles as the frail old man on the curb. Now hearing this, her heart ached even more. "He's sick, isn't he?" "Yes," Derek replied, his jaw tightening. "Parkinson's. I provide for him, but he's stubborn. He wanders off sometimes. That's how he ended up outside the mansion that morning. But when I found him later, and he told me what you did—" Derek's voice trailed thick with emotion. He cleared his throat and looked at her intently. "Elizabeth, you were the only one who saw him as a man, not as a burden, not as an embarrassment, but as a human being." Her lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears. "I only did what I hoped someone would have done for my father when he was alive." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. Derek studied her, his eyes soft but sharp, as though he was weighing more than just her words. He was weighing her heart. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice low but certain. "Elizabeth, I didn't come here just to thank you. I came because I believe people like you deserve more. You may have lost your job, but what you showed my father that day, it's worth more than anything money can buy." Elizabeth's breath caught, her mind racing. She couldn't yet understand what he was leading to, but she could feel it. Something was about to change. Derek's next words would leave Elizabeth speechless, because what he was about to offer her wasn't just a job. It was a chance at a whole new life. Elizabeth stared at Derek, her breath uneven, waiting for him to continue. His presence filled the tiny room, not in an intimidating way, but in a way that felt impossible to ignore. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, his gaze steady. "I'm a businessman," Derek began. "Some call me a billionaire. Titles don't mean much to me, but I've been blessed with wealth. And in my line of work, I meet all kinds of people, ambitious ones, greedy ones, selfish ones. But very rarely do I meet someone with a heart like yours." Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "Sir, I don't understand. I only gave your father food. Anyone would have done the same." "No." Derek's voice was firm yet warm. "Not anyone. If that were true, he wouldn't have been sitting out there alone. He told me that when you spoke to him, you called him Papa's. Do you realize how long it's been since someone treated him like family?" Elizabeth's throat tightened. Tears stung her eyes as she remembered kneeling beside the frail man, wrapping the blanket over his shoulders. She had thought only of her late father, of the pain of watching him suffer. She hadn't realized what that small gesture might have meant to Charles. Derek continued, his tone shifting from tender to resolute. Elizabeth, I don't want to just thank you. I want to help you tell me what is your dream. What have you always wanted to do, but never could? Elizabeth's lips parted, but no words came out her dream. It had been so long since she even allowed herself to think about it. She glanced at Samuel, who watched from the corner with wide, hopeful eyes. Slowly, she whispered, almost ashamed of it. I always wanted to be a nurse, to help people, to take care of the sick, the way I wished I could have taken care of my father. But that's impossible now. I don't have the money. I barely have enough to keep this roof over our heads. Her voice broke, and she lowered her gaze, embarrassed to reveal such a fragile piece of herself. But Derek's response was immediate. Then consider it done. Elizabeth's head snapped up. I will sponsor you, Derek said, his eyes never leaving hers. Nursing school, every expense covered. Books, tuition, living costs. You won't have to worry about any of it. You gave my father dignity when he had none. You gave him compassion when he felt forgotten. The least I can do is make sure your kindness doesn't go unrewarded. For a moment, Elizabeth couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. All those nights she had prayed. All those years she had buried her dream beneath survival. And now here was a man she barely knew, offering her the impossible. Why me? She whispered through the tears. Derek's answer was simple, yet powerful. Because the world needs more people like you, Elizabeth. And I have the means to make sure you don't waste your gift. Elizabeth broke down completely, her sobs muffled in her hands. Samuel rushed to her side, holding her tightly, his own eyes wet with tears. For the first time in years, hope flickered like a flame inside their small, broken home. In that moment, Elizabeth's life shifted. She had lost everything 3 days ago. Now she stood at the doorway of a future she never thought possible. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The following weeks felt like stepping into a different world. Elizabeth had spent nearly 5 years polishing silver and scrubbing floors. But now she found herself sitting in classrooms filled with whiteboards, textbooks, and eager young students. The smell of chalk and ink replaced the scent of cleaning detergents. For the first time in years, her hands no longer held a mop, but a pen. Her first day at nursing school was both thrilling and terrifying. She wore a modest second-hand skirt and blouse that Derek's assistant had helped her find. Though neat and pressed, she still felt the weight of eyes on her. As she entered the room, some students chatted confidently in groups, their laughter filling the air. Elizabeth, carrying only a small notebook and an old bag, slipped into a seat at the back. Whispers started almost immediately. Is she older than us? She doesn't look like she belongs here. Maybe she's a charity case. Elizabeth's cheeks burned, but she kept her head down, gripping her pen tightly. She had faced worse whispers in the Baldwin mansion, she reminded herself. Still, the sting of being judged never truly faded. That evening, as she returned to her apartment, exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Samuel sat waiting with excitement in his eyes. How was it, sister? Elizabeth forced a smile, though her shoulders slumped. It was different, but I'll manage. Samuel grinned. You will do more than manage. You'll be the best nurse they've ever seen. His words were simple, but they gave her strength. She sat beside him, helping with his homework, while her own textbooks lay open in front of her. Together they studied late into the night, the dim light of a single bulb flickering above them. Over the weeks, Elizabeth faced challenges. She had never imagined she struggled to keep up with the medical terms, often staying up until dawn, memorizing anatomy charts. Her hands, once skilled at scrubbing, now trembled over exams and quizzes. Some classmates continued to mock her, whispering about her accent, her worn-out shoes, her humble appearance. But each time doubt crept in. She thought of two men, her late father, who had suffered without proper care, and Charles Baldwin, whose frail body had reminded her why this path mattered. Their faces gave her purpose. Their struggles lit a fire within her. One evening, exhausted from lectures, Elizabeth found Charles waiting outside the campus gates. He sat in a wheelchair now, Derek standing proudly behind him. "My daughter," Charles said warmly, his voice shaky but filled with pride. "You are walking the path you were meant for." Elizabeth's eyes welled with tears to hear him call her daughter. It gave her the courage to keep pushing forward. But even as Elizabeth began to rise, the bond between her and Charles was about to grow deeper than either of them expected. The weeks rolled into months, and with every passing day, Elizabeth's life shifted further away from the maid she once was. Yet, the transformation wasn't only about books and classrooms. It was about the people who stood by her side. Chief among them was Charles Baldwin. Charles had begun visiting her regularly. Sometimes Derek wheeled him into the small campus cafe where they'd share tea. Other times he came to her apartment with fruits or warm bread. Elizabeth always worried it was too much trouble for him, but Charles brushed her concerns aside. "Don't you see, my dear," he said one afternoon as she adjusted the blanket over his lap, "you've given me something I thought I had lost forever. I've family. When you called me Papas that day, something inside me healed." Elizabeth swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I only did what my heart told me. I saw my father in you." Charles smiled faintly, his frail hand resting over hers. "And I see my daughter in you. I may not have raised you, Elizabeth, but if I could, I would have been proud to call you mine." Her chest tightened, emotions swirling inside her. For years she had carried the loneliness of losing her father, the weight of struggling alone. Now, sitting beside Charles, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long, a sense of belonging. Their conversation stretched for hours. Charles told her stories of his youth, of the choices he regretted, of the coldness of wealth that had pushed him to leave the mansion. Elizabeth shared her struggles too, how she had once dreamed of nursing, but buried that dream under survival. How she fought each day to give Samuel a future better than her own. Sometimes Samuel would join them, and Charles would beam at the boy, telling him, "You remind me of myself when I was young, except you're smarter. Don't waste that gift." Samuel, shy but proud, would nod, clearly drinking in every word. The bond grew, so natural, so real, that neighbors began to whisper about the strange sight of a wealthy man sitting outside a tiny apartment, laughing and talking with a maid-turned-student. But to Elizabeth, it didn't matter what they thought. For the first time in her life, she had found a father again. One evening, as Charles prepared to leave, he looked at her with misty eyes. "Elizabeth, promise me something. Promise me that no matter how hard it gets, you'll never let the world harden your heart. Your kindness saved me. It may yet save many more." Elizabeth clasped his hand tightly, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to fall. "I promise, Papa." But as Elizabeth held on to that promise, the world was about to test her again. This time, not with loss, but with a triumph she had fought so hard to earn. The day of graduation arrived. With the morning sun spilling golden light across the city, Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the simple white gown draped over her shoulders. Samuel beamed at her from the corner, his smile wide and proud. "You did it, sister," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of all their struggles. "You really did it." Elizabeth looked at her reflection, older than most of her classmates, her face marked with lines of sacrifice and endurance, but her eyes glowed with something new, hope, a purpose. She pressed a hand to her chest, whispering, "We did it. Samuel, this was for both of us." The auditorium buzzed with excitement. Families crowded the seats, clapping and cheering as names were called. Elizabeth sat quietly among her classmates, her heart pounding. When her name echoed through the hall, she rose slowly, her legs trembling. As she walked across the stage, she searched the crowd and then she saw them. Charles Baldwin sat in the front row, a blanket over his lap, his trembling hands clapping with all the strength he could muster. Beside him stood Derek, tall and proud, his eyes shining with emotion. Samuel sat close by, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. Elizabeth's throat tightened. Every step she took felt heavier, until at last she received the certificate, placed gently in her hands. The applause that followed seemed to echo louder than anything she had ever heard. She had once been invisible, a maid in the shadows of chandeliers. Now the entire hall was clapping for her. Charles leaned toward Derek and whispered, though loud enough for Elizabeth to hear, as she descended the stage, "That's my daughter." His voice broke and tears rolled freely down his cheeks. Elizabeth bit her lip, fighting back her own tears as she returned to her seat. In that moment, every humiliation, every hardship, every night of hunger and doubt, it all melted away. She had not only survived, she had triumphed. And yet, not everyone celebrated. Somewhere in the crowd, hidden at the back, Mistress Baldwin sat stiffly, her face pale with disbelief. She had refused to clap, refused to acknowledge the maid she had once thrown out like trash. Now she was forced to watch, as Elizabeth stood, honored, respected and cherished in front of everyone. Elizabeth did not look her way. She no longer needed her approval. Her eyes were fixed on the family she had chosen, the ones who had chosen her in return. Elizabeth had achieved her dream. But her story was only beginning. For the world was waiting, not for the maid she once was, but for the healer she was destined to be. The first time, Elizabeth walked into the hospital wearing her nurse's uniform. She felt her heart swell with pride. The crisp white fabric was simple, nothing like the fine silks of the Baldwin mansion. Yet, it carried more dignity than any gown she had ever seen. For once, she wasn't entering a place to scrub floors or to serve food. She was entering to serve humanity. Her first patient was a frail elderly woman who struggled to breathe. Elizabeth leaned down, gently adjusting her pillow, and whispered, "You're safe. I'll take care of you." The woman's tired eyes softened, and Elizabeth felt it again. That spark, the same spark that made her kneel by Charles Baldwin on the curbside that morning. The spark of kindness that had cost her a job, but given her a purpose. Word of her journey spread quietly through the hospital halls. Staff admired her patience. The patients whispered about the nurse, who spoke with compassion, who never rushed, who treated them like family. Some said she had a gift, but Elizabeth only smiled humbly. She knew it wasn't a gift, it was a choice she had made, and would keep making every single day. Charles often visited her at the hospital, sometimes wheeled in by Derek, sometimes arriving with Samuel, who was now chasing his own studies. He'd sit quietly in the corner, watching her work with pride in his eyes. One afternoon, as she placed a blanket over a sleeping patient, Charles said softly, "You remind me of who I wanted to be when I was younger. You turned pain into healing." Elizabeth never stopped. She turned and squeezed his hand. "I won't, Papa. Not as long as I live." And Derek, though busy with his businesses, never failed to check in. He often told her, "The world sees wealth as money, Elizabeth, but people like you remind me that true wealth is kindness." At night, Elizabeth would return home, often exhausted, but her heart brimmed with peace. The tiny apartment that once felt like a cage of despair now felt like a temple of hope. Samuel studied late into the night. Inspired by her perseverance, she sometimes caught him staring at her proudly, and she would laugh, saying, "Your turn is coming, Samuel. Just wait." Elizabeth never returned to the life of scrubbing floors in silence. She had walked through fire and lost everything, and found a life far richer than she ever imagined. And sometimes, when the weight of her new role pressed down, she'd close her eyes and whisper the words she had once said to herself while dragging her suitcase away from the Baldwin mansion. I don't regret it, not today, not ever. Because in the end, kindness had not destroyed her. It had built her. It had given her everything. And that is how Elizabeth, the maid who was fired for kindness, discovered the truth that the world tried to hide from her. When you choose compassion, you may lose what you thought you needed, but you gain what you were always meant to have.